If a painting can lie, then everything in this room is already broken. In the heart of Manhattan's most exclusive art gallery, silence had value. Crystal lights reflected off white walls, champagne conversations floating like background noise. Emily Carter moved quietly through the exhibition floor, dressed in a simple uniform. No one truly looked at her, not the guests, not the collectors, not even security. She was just part of the room, like the air conditioning or polished marble. At the center of the hall stood William Harrington, billionaire art collector and authority. People gathered around him, waiting for his opinion like it was law itself. He believed art was something you owned, controlled, and understood completely through wealth. Tonight, a newly unveiled painting hung under spotlight, drawing admiration from every direction. Critics called it priceless, a lost masterpiece returned to the world of elites. Emily stopped walking when she reached it, her eyes locking onto the canvas. Something about it felt wrong, not obvious, but precise in a disturbing way. She tilted her head slightly, studying brushwork others passed by without a second thought. A quiet breath left her lips, almost unnoticed even by herself. "This doesn't belong here," she said softly, almost as if thinking aloud. The words barely carried across the polished floor, yet they changed the air instantly. Nearby guests paused, some turning, unsure if they had heard her correctly. From across the room, William Harrington slowly turned his head toward her voice. And for the first time that evening, he looked directly at a waitress. William's expression tightened, not anger yet, but curiosity sharpened by disbelief. In his world, people either praised his judgment or stayed silent. There was no in-between. He took a slow step forward, eyes fixed on Emily as if recalculating her existence. The gallery manager nervously moved closer, sensing something delicate about to break. Emily, however, did not step back, her gaze still anchored to the painting. There were details others admired, but she saw inconsistencies no one else noticed. A faint imperfection in the pigment caught the edge of her attention like a whisper, and in that silence, before anyone could question her again, she spoke once more. "It's not authentic," Emily said calmly, as the billionaire finally began to listen. William Harrington did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied Emily Carter as if she had interrupted something far larger than a conversation, something built on years of certainty. The gallery around them seemed to tighten, the quiet shifting into an uncomfortable stillness. Guests exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether they had just witnessed confidence or delusion. The billionaire finally stepped closer to the painting, his eyes narrowing as he scanned every inch of the canvas she had just questioned. "That is a serious claim," he said calmly, his voice controlled but sharp with disbelief. Around him, a few collectors gave quiet, uneasy laughs, as if to dismiss what they had heard before it became real. A senior art curator stepped forward, adjusting his glasses, clearly offended by the suggestion. "This piece has been authenticated through multiple international reviews," he stated firmly, gesturing toward the certificate display beside the artwork. Emily did not move back. She kept her gaze steady on the painting, her expression unchanged, as though the room had not shifted against her. "Authentication confirms ownership and paperwork," she replied softly, "not origin." That single line cut through the murmurs like a precise edge. William turned back toward her, now fully engaged, his earlier dismissal replaced with a colder curiosity. "Explain," he said simply. The room seemed to hold its breath. Emily stepped closer to the painting, not touching it, but observing it with quiet intensity. "The pigment layering is inconsistent with the claimed period," she said, her voice steady, almost clinical. "This shade of blue was not available in that era's mineral composition records. It was synthesized decades later." A few heads turned toward the curator. He frowned but did not interrupt. Emily continued, her eyes tracking small details most people would never notice. "The canvas weave is modern industrial production. The texture is too uniform, too clean. Original works from that century always show natural irregularities from hand preparation." The room grew quieter. Even the skeptical laughter faded. William's expression tightened slightly, but he remained composed, watching her as if recalibrating the weight of her words. Emily pointed subtly toward the lower corner of the painting. And the signature placement is incorrect for the artist's documented habits. It appears to be imitated rather than placed with intent. The curator stepped forward again, this time less confident. That level of detail would require extensive restoration knowledge, he said cautiously. Emily did not look at him. Or restoration experience, she replied. Pause followed, heavier than before. William's eyes narrowed further, not in anger now, but in calculation. You are saying this is a reproduction, he said slowly. Emily finally turned her head slightly toward him. Yes, she answered simply. The word landed differently this time, not as an opinion but as a conclusion. A subtle shift moved through the room as collectors leaned in, re-examining what they had already accepted as truth. William stared at the painting again, his jaw tightening for the first time. Then he looked back at Emily Carter, the waitress no one had noticed minutes earlier, and realized she had not once changed her certainty under pressure. For a moment after Emily Carter finished speaking, the entire gallery seemed to lose its confidence in silence. William Harrington stood motionless, his eyes moving between the painting and the woman who had just challenged the foundation of the event. Around them, guests shifted uncomfortably, waiting for authority to restore order to something that no longer felt stable. The senior curator quickly stepped closer to the artwork again, as if proximity could correct reality. That is not possible, he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. William raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to slow everything down. He was no longer reacting like a man being entertained, but like someone recalculating risk. You are very confident, William said to Emily, his tone controlled but sharper now. Emily did not look intimidated. She kept her attention on the painting, as if the presence of wealth and authority did not alter what her eyes already understood. Confidence is not the point, she replied. Accuracy is. A ripple of discomfort moved through the nearby guests. One of the collectors whispered something about calling the authentication board, while another took a step back from the display as if distance might change the outcome. William studied her face more carefully now, noticing what he had ignored before. She was not performing for attention. She was not guessing. She was observing with a kind of familiarity that did not belong in a waitress uniform. If you are correct, William said slowly, then this piece should not exist in this room. Emily finally turned her head slightly toward him. It already does not belong here, she said again, softer this time, but even more certain. The curator interjected quickly, attempting to regain control. We have provenance documents, verified transfers, and multiple expert confirmations, he insisted. Emily nodded once, acknowledging him without yielding. Documentation can be copied, she said. Expert opinion can be influenced. Materials cannot lie. That statement settled heavily over the room. William stepped closer to the painting again, his expression tightening as he examined it with renewed focus. For the first time, he did not look at it as an owner of art, but as someone being asked to question it. Emily continued, her voice steady but quiet, drawing attention not by volume but by precision. The layering technique used here was not developed until after the supposed creation date. It would require knowledge that did not exist at the time. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they no longer had the expertise to contradict her. William turned back toward her again, his skepticism now mixed with something more complex. And you learned all of this where? He asked. A gallery floor during a shift? Emily paused briefly, then answered without hesitation. I studied restoration and preservation before I worked anywhere like this. The answer shifted the atmosphere again. The curator's expression changed subtly, as if trying to place her name or memory against that claim. William's gaze sharpened, no longer dismissive, now investigative. Why would someone with that background be serving tables? He asked. Emily's expression did not change, but something in her eyes hardened slightly, not with anger, but with restraint. Because knowledge does not always protect people from circumstance, she said calmly. The words hung in the air longer than anything else that evening. William looked at her for several seconds without speaking, then slowly returned his attention to the painting, as if trying to decide whether he was witnessing confidence, mistake, or something far more inconvenient. For the first time since the exhibition began, he was no longer certain of what he owned, and even less certain of who in the room understood the truth better than he did. The tension in the gallery did not fade after Emily Carter's explanation. It only deepened into something quieter and far more uncomfortable. William Harrington remained near the painting, his eyes fixed as if distance would reveal a different truth. Around him, guests no longer spoke with confidence. Their earlier admiration had turned into hesitation, and hesitation into doubt they were not ready to admit aloud. The curator stepped forward again, this time attempting to salvage authority rather than defend certainty. Even if there are irregularities, he said carefully, that does not immediately confirm falsification. Emily stood calmly a few steps away, her posture unchanged, her attention no longer seeking approval or validation. It does not need to be immediate, she replied. It only needs to be correct. William turned toward her again, studying her with a slower, more deliberate focus. Something in her tone had shifted the conversation from opinion to process. He gestured slightly toward the painting. "Walk me through it," he said. It was not a request made out of politeness, but out of necessity. Emily stepped closer to the artwork again, keeping a respectful distance. Her eyes traced the surface with practiced precision. "The first inconsistency is in the pigment distribution," she began. "It does not match the historical chemical limitations of the claimed period. The second is in the layering technique, which reflects modern restoration tools rather than traditional application." The room grew quieter with each sentence, as if sound itself was becoming riskier. William listened without interruption, his expression tightening not with anger, but with focus that had replaced doubt. Emily continued, her voice steady and controlled. "There is also micro-pattern repetition in the background texture. Natural handwork does not repeat itself with that level of mechanical precision." A collector near the back shifted uneasily. The curator opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. William raised his hand slightly, not to silence anyone, but to maintain control over the moment. "You are saying this was intentionally created to deceive," he said. Emily did not exaggerate her response. "I am saying it was created with knowledge of how authenticity is verified, not with knowledge of the original artist's process." That distinction landed heavily. William looked at the painting again, and for the first time, his expression showed something closer to uncertainty than authority. He had built much of his reputation on recognition, on being the person who could identify value where others could not. Now, in front of him, stood someone who was dismantling that certainty without raising her voice once. The curator finally stepped in again, but his tone was no longer defensive, only cautious. "If what she is suggesting is correct, we would need external verification immediately." William did not respond to him right away. His attention remained on Emily. "And you are certain?" he asked, "based only on observation." Emily met his gaze briefly, then returned it to the painting. "Based on training, repetition, and time spent restoring what others damaged or misunderstood," she said. A silence followed that felt heavier than the earlier noise of the exhibition. William slowly exhaled, his posture shifting slightly as if recalibrating not just the painting, but the entire situation. Around them, guests were no longer watching the artwork. They were watching her. The waitress who had not raised her voice, yet had changed the meaning of the room entirely. And for the first time since the evening began, William Harrington did not look like the person in control of the gallery. The silence in the gallery no longer felt like respect. It felt like anticipation stretched too thin to hold. William Harrington finally stepped away from the painting, breaking the fixed distance he had maintained as if proximity alone could preserve authority. His eyes shifted between Emily Carter and the artwork, as though both now demanded equal analysis. Around them, Guests had stopped pretending to be casual observers. Every glance carried the weight of uncertainty. The curator looked increasingly unsettled, no longer speaking with certainty but searching for reassurance that no one in the room was willing to give. William slowly turned fully toward Emily. "If this is incorrect," he said, his voice lower now, "it damages more than just this exhibition." Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "Then it should be questioned properly," she replied. The simplicity of her answer created a pause that no one immediately filled. William studied her for a long moment, then made a subtle gesture toward his assistant standing near the edge of the room. "Bring the provenance file," he said quietly. The assistant hesitated for only a second before moving quickly, as if the request had suddenly become urgent. Emily remained still, her attention no longer on the crowd but on the structure of the painting itself, as if the truth she had already identified did not require external validation. The curator attempted once more to speak. "We can initiate an internal review," he said carefully, "but we should not jump to conclusions based on observation alone." William did not respond to him. His focus had already shifted elsewhere. When the assistant returned with a tablet displaying the documented history of the painting, William accepted it and began reviewing the information in silence. The room seemed to shrink around the soundless scrolling. Emily stood nearby, waiting without impatience, as if time had no influence on what she already understood. William's expression changed gradually as he read, not dramatically, but in subtle stages that only someone watching closely would notice. A slight tightening of the jaw, a pause in his eye movement, then stillness. He stopped scrolling. "This certification chain references a restoration record that does not match known institutional archives," he said quietly. The curator stepped forward immediately. "That is impossible," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Emily did not react to the growing tension. "It happens when documentation is recreated rather than preserved," she said calmly. William lowered the tablet slightly, looking at her again. "You recognize this from sight alone," he said, not as a challenge, but as an attempt to understand the scale of what he was witnessing. Emily nodded once. "From training, and from having restored pieces that were damaged in similar ways." A new silence settled, different from before. This one carried consequence. William exhaled slowly, then turned his attention back to the painting, now no longer as its collector, but as someone evaluating its legitimacy in real time. "If this is confirmed," he said, "the implications extend beyond this gallery." Emily's expression remained steady, but her tone softened slightly. "That is usually how it works," she replied. The curator finally stepped back, visibly unsettled, as if the foundation of his professional certainty had been quietly removed beneath him. William remained still for several seconds, then spoke again, this time with controlled clarity. "Begin formal verification immediately," he said to his assistant. Then he looked back at Emily Carter. For the first time, his expression was no longer guarded authority, but measured recognition. Not of agreement, but of something far more uncomfortable. The realization that the truth in front of him had not required his permission to exist. The decision to begin formal verification changed the atmosphere inside the gallery immediately. Conversations that had once carried the soft rhythm of luxury now broke into fragmented whispers, as guests began to realize they were no longer observing an exhibition, but an unfolding investigation. William Harrington stood near the center of it all, no longer surrounded by admirers, but by uncertainty. His assistant moved quickly across the floor, already contacting external experts, while security discreetly adjusted their positions, not out of alarm but protocol. Emily Carter remained where she had been, still and composed, as if the escalation around her existed in a separate layer of reality. William finally broke his silence and turned fully toward her again. "If your assessment is correct," he said carefully, "then this will not remain a private matter." Emily nodded slightly. "It rarely does," she replied. There was no pride in her voice, only understanding. A nearby guest attempted a quiet comment about overreaction, but the curator's lack of response discouraged further skepticism. The room was no longer divided by opinion, but by the growing recognition that something had shifted beyond control. William stepped a little closer to Emily, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You realize what this means for provenance records across multiple collections," he said. Emily met his gaze briefly. "It means patterns will be reviewed again," she answered, "and assumptions will be challenged." The simplicity of her words contrasted with the weight of their implication. The assistant returned within minutes, speaking quietly into William's ear. The message was not fully audible to those nearby, but the reaction was immediate. William's expression tightened slightly, not in shock, but in confirmation of concern. He raised his hand, signaling for discretion, then turned back to Emily. "External specialists are being contacted," he said. "They will arrive within the hour." Emily gave a slight nod, as if this was the expected outcome rather than a development. The curator attempted to reassert control over the situation. "We should avoid public speculation until verification is complete," he said, but his tone no longer carried authority. William did not respond to him. Instead, his attention remained fixed on Emily, as if the center of gravity in the room had shifted without permission. "Tell me something," William said after a pause. "If you were not working as a waitress, where would you be right now?" The question changed the rhythm of the moment. It was no longer about the painting alone. Emily hesitated briefly, not out of uncertainty, but out of calculation. "I would be restoring artifacts in a controlled conservation environment," she said. "Or I would be teaching others how to recognize what is real and what is not." William absorbed this without interruption. Around them, the verification process continued in quiet motion, emails sent, calls made, experts contacted across different cities. Yet, inside the gallery, the most significant shift was no longer technical. It was perception. The way people looked at Emily Carter had changed. She was no longer simply a waitress who had spoken out of turn. She had become the reference point against which everything else was now being measured. William finally spoke again, his voice lower than before. "If you are right," he said, "you did not just identify a painting. You changed the value of everything around it." Emily looked back at the artwork once more, her expression unchanged. "Truth does that," she replied quietly. The first signs of confirmation did not arrive as celebration, but as silence that felt heavier than before. Inside the gallery, even the smallest movements now carried meaning, as if every step was being measured against an unfolding conclusion. William Harrington stood still for a long moment after Emily Carter spoke, his attention no longer divided between authority and observation, but fully focused on her presence. Around them, the external verification process continued in the background, invisible yet increasingly influential on the mood of the room. When William finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "If what you have identified is validated," he said, "then the implications extend far beyond this exhibition." Emily Carter gave a slight nod, her expression unchanged. "It always does," she replied. There was no emphasis in her tone, only certainty shaped by experience. A few guests nearby exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the situation had moved beyond curiosity into consequence. The curator stood slightly apart now, no longer attempting to argue, but instead waiting for information that could no longer be controlled internally. William slowly turned his gaze toward Emily again. "People will ask how this was missed," he said. Emily responded without hesitation. "They will ask, but the answer will not change what is already true." Her words settled into the space between them with quiet finality. At that moment, William's assistant returned once again, this time with a more urgent expression. He leaned in and spoke briefly, and William's focus sharpened immediately. Without raising his voice, William acknowledged the update and dismissed the assistant with a small gesture. When he turned back, his expression had shifted from controlled curiosity to measured acknowledgement. "The initial external review is aligning with your assessment," he said. A subtle change moved through the surrounding guests as the weight of that statement spread. The curator closed his eyes briefly, as if recalibrating everything he had believed about the painting's origin. Emily did not react outwardly. She simply remained still, as though confirmation was not validation, but repetition of something already known. William took a step closer to the painting, then spoke again, not to the room but to her. "Do you understand what you have done here today?" he asked. Emily considered the question for a brief moment. "I identified what was present," she said. "What happens after that is not mine to decide." The clarity of her response created another silence, different from before. It was no longer disbelief or tension, but recognition that control over the situation had already shifted. William looked at her more directly now, not as a guest or observer, but as someone whose position in the room no longer fit any category he had previously defined. "You are not just observant," he said slowly. "You are trained at a level most people never encounter." Emily met his gaze briefly. "Training only matters when people are willing to see what it teaches," she replied. The words carried no accusation, only fact. Around them, notifications continued to arrive on William's device, each one reinforcing the same direction of conclusion. The painting was no longer being discussed as questionable, but as misrepresented. William finally lowered his phone, his expression settling into something more reflective than authoritative. He looked at Emily Carter again, and for the first time since the evening began, his certainty about status, hierarchy, and expectation had been replaced by something far less comfortable. Not confusion, but recognition that the person standing in front of him had never needed the room to understand it. The confirmation that began as a quiet technical update had now fully changed the atmosphere inside the gallery, turning it into a space where every second felt heavier than the last. William Harrington stood in near silence, holding his position as new information continued to arrive through his assistant. Each update reinforced the same direction, each one narrowing the gap between doubt and certainty. Around them, guests had stopped pretending this was still an ordinary exhibition. Their attention now shifted between the painting and Emily Carter, as if both had become equally important to understanding what was unfolding. The curator remained still, his earlier confidence replaced by restrained uncertainty. William finally spoke again, his voice calm but measured. "The external specialists are not disputing your assessment," he said. Emily Carter did not react to the phrasing. She simply remained focused on the painting, as though validation from others was secondary to the clarity she had already reached. "Then the analysis is consistent," she replied. A few guests exchanged glances, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond dispute and into conclusion. William slowly stepped closer to Emily, lowering his voice slightly. "Do you realize what this means in practical terms?" he asked. "This painting is part of a larger collection that has already been distributed through multiple private acquisitions." Emily turned her head slightly toward him. "Then those acquisitions will need to be reviewed," she said calmly. There was no hesitation in her tone, only logical extension. William studied her more carefully now. He was no longer evaluating her claim alone, but the structure of her reasoning. "Most people would not be able to reach that conclusion from observation alone," he said. Emily responded without emphasis. "Most people are not trained to look beyond surface confirmation." That statement lingered in the air, difficult to refute because it contained no emotion to challenge. At that moment, William's assistant approached again, this time with a more formal posture. He handed over a printed report rather than a device, as if the information required physical weight to match its significance. William reviewed it in silence. The room waited without movement. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but noticeably different. "Independent verification is now aligning with full misattribution," he said. A quiet shift passed through the guests, not of surprise anymore, but of realization. The curator closed his eyes briefly, then lowered his head slightly, acknowledging what could no longer be defended. Emily Carter remained unchanged. Her presence in the room did not expand or diminish with the confirmation. It simply remained consistent. William lowered the report and looked at her again, this time without the filter of skepticism or authority. "You identified this faster than a full institutional review," he said. Emily replied simply, Because I was not relying on assumption layers built over time. The answer was precise, but it carried weight beyond its simplicity. William nodded slowly, absorbing the implication. If you had not spoken today, he said, this would have remained undiscovered for a long time. Emily finally turned fully toward him. It would have been discovered eventually, she said. The truth does not remain hidden indefinitely. It only waits for someone willing to see it clearly. The statement settled over the room like a final alignment of perspective. William looked around briefly at the guests, then back at the painting, then finally at Emily Carter. For the first time since the exhibition began, he no longer saw hierarchy in the room. He saw recognition, not of wealth, not of status, but of understanding. And in that realization, the balance of the entire evening had already changed. The final confirmation arrived without drama, but its weight settled across the gallery like something irreversible had already taken place. William Harrington stood in silence for several seconds after reviewing the latest report, his expression no longer shifting between doubt and control, but settling into a steady awareness that the situation had moved beyond his original authority. Around him, the guests had fallen into a quiet state of observation, no longer reacting to each update, only absorbing it. The curator remained still, his earlier confidence fully dissolved into professional silence. Emily Carter stood slightly apart from the center of attention, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, as if the outcome had never depended on approval in the first place. William finally broke the silence, his voice lower than before. The full review confirms misattribution across multiple authentication layers, he said. A subtle shift moved through the room, not of surprise, but of final acknowledgement. Emily gave a slight nod, as if the result aligned with something already understood rather than newly revealed. William turned fully toward her now, no longer as an observer of an unexpected claim, but as someone confronting the source of certainty itself. This changes ownership status and valuation across the entire record chain, he said. Emily responded calmly. It corrects the record. What follows is procedure. Her tone carried no emphasis, only structure. A few guests quietly stepped back from the painting, as if distance could help them process the shift in meaning. The curator exhaled slowly, finally accepting what could no longer be challenged. William studied Emily for a long moment, then spoke again, his voice measured but different from before. You did not hesitate once, he said. Emily looked back at him briefly. Hesitation usually comes from uncertainty, she replied. There was none here. The simplicity of her answer made the space between them feel sharper, not louder. William nodded once, absorbing the implication. Most people in this room rely on consensus before speaking, he said. Emily's gaze returned to the painting. Consensus does not determine accuracy, she said quietly. That statement settled across the gallery with finality. The external specialists began preparing formal documentation updates in real time, their communication visible through William's assistant as the process shifted from review to confirmation. The painting was no longer an object of admiration, but a case of correction in motion. William slowly lowered his hand holding the report and looked at Emily Carter again. The environment around him still belonged to the world of wealth and authority, but his perception of it had shifted. You were not guessing, he said quietly. Emily replied without turning away from the artwork. Guessing is not part of restoration work. That line ended the remaining ambiguity in the room. William stood still for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, not of agreement alone, but of recognition that the structure he had relied on to evaluate truth had just been fundamentally challenged. And in that silence, with confirmation now complete, Emily Carter remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, not elevated by the result, not changed by attention, only thebiton in the clarity of what she had always seen.